Evening, friends, the fire's burning low tonight. Just a thin ring of orange left around the edges of those last two logs, and even that seems content to take its time. No hurry in it. The kind of fire that knows it's done most of its work already and is just keeping company now. The way an old friend will sit with you on a porch and say nothing at all for an hour and feel no need to apologize for the silence. There's a smell to a fire at this stage that's different from when it's first catching or when it's roaring full. It's softer, almost sweet, like the wood has given up everything it had to give, and what's left is just warmth remembering itself. I can feel it on my hands, on my knees, just barely, and the night air is cool enough around the edges that the two of them, the warmth and the cool, seem to reach some kind of agreement right here where I'm sitting. Cottonwood Creek is quiet tonight. Not the quiet of something waiting, mind you, just the ordinary quiet of a place that has settled into itself after a long day. I can hear the creek from here, though it's a ways off, running soft over the stones the way it does this time of year. A little lower than spring, a little steadier than autumn. The sound of water that knows its path and doesn't need to think about where it's going. I've lived beside that creek my whole life. There was a summer, though, late in the season, 1890, if memory serves, and I believe it does on this particular count because I remember the date in the ledger. I was keeping the deputy's log by then, had been for a few years, writing down the small things that happened each day in a hand that was neater then than it is now. The sheriff at the time was a man named Harlan Goss, and Harlan believed in the ledger the way some men believe in scripture. He said a town that didn't write down its days would forget what it was, and forgetting what you were was the first step toward becoming something you didn't intend. I never argued with that. Seemed right to me then, and seems right to me still. But the entry I'm thinking of wasn't much. Just a line, maybe two. Something about the creek level and the heat and how the cottonwoods along the south bank were dropping leaves earlier than usual. I wrote it down the way I wrote down everything, plain and without decoration, and I didn't think much of it at the time. But the day itself, it was August, deep August. The kind of August where the morning starts warm and the afternoon doesn't so much get hot as it simply refuses to be anything else. The sky that month had been pale, washed out, like someone had taken a rag to it and rubbed away the deeper blue and left behind something closer to the color of old flour sacking. No clouds to speak of, or if there were, they were so high and thin they barely qualified. Just a wide, pale lid sitting over the valley, pressing the heat down into the streets and the dust and the boards of every building in town. I'd been up since before first light. That was habit, not necessity. When you spend enough years waking early, your body just does it whether you ask it to or not. And after a while you stop minding. There's something to be said for those minutes before the sun clears the ridge. The air is different, cooler in a way that feels borrowed, like the night is lending you a last little portion of itself before it moves on. I'd stand on my porch in those minutes, my boots not yet laced, my hat not yet on, and I'd just listen. The town was still asleep. No hammers, no wagon wheels, no voices calling across the street. Just the creek and the birds beginning to sort themselves out in the cottonwoods. And now I laced my boots on the porch step, took my time with it, There's a particular satisfaction in lacing boots slowly when there's no one waiting on you and no errand pulling at your sleeve. The leather was warm already, even though the sun hadn't crested yet, holding the heat from the day before, the way leather does when it doesn't get a chance to fully cool. I pulled the laces through each eyelet with care, crossed them over, pulled again, and when I was done, I set both feet flat on the ground and let them settle, the way you let a horse settle into a new shoe. A small thing, but I remember it. The walk into town from my place was short, maybe a quarter-mile along the road that ran parallel to the creek, then a left turn at the old fence post where Emmett Grady had once tried to hang a gate and given up halfway, leaving the post standing alone with its 2 iron hinges rusting into nothing. The post is still there, or was for a long time after. I used it as a landmark, the way most folks in Cottonwood Creek used landmarks. Not because we needed directions in a town we could walk blindfolded, but because certain objects become part of how you think about a place, the way the door to the general store was latched properly. I could tell without testing it, because the latch threw a small shadow at a particular angle when it was seated correctly, and I'd learned to read that shadow the way you learn to read a clock. Abigail Marsh, who ran the store after her husband passed, was careful about her latch, and in all my years of checking, I don't believe I ever found it undone. But I looked anyway, because the looking was the point. The act of paying attention to a thing, even a thing you know is fine, is its own kind of care. I think Harlan Goss understood that, though he never said it in so many words. He just expected the ledger to be filled, and he expected the walk to be walked, and he expected that both would be done with the same steady attention, whether anything was amiss or not. Past the general store, the barber shop, closed, of course, at that hour. The pole out front had faded some that summer, the red losing its sharpness, the white going to... I continued north. The sun was coming now, not yet above the buildings but throwing a warm tint across the upper portions of the facades, catching the second-floor windows of the hotel and making them flash briefly before the angle shifted and they went dark again. The heat would follow soon. I could feel it gathering, the way you can feel a word gathering in someone's mouth before they say it. Not there yet, but coming, inevitable. At the north end of the street, I turned and started back. This was the pattern, up and back, then a pause at the office to write in the ledger before the day's actual business began. Most mornings, the walk yielded nothing worth writing about, and I'd put down something simple, calm morning, all secure. And that would be the whole of it. But the walk itself mattered more than what I wrote. It was a way of saying to the town, even though no one was awake to hear it, that someone was paying attention, that the street was watched, that the doors were checked, that the day had been received and noted. I reached the office and let myself in. The office, I wrote, creek running lower than previous weeks, heat continuing, cottonwood leaves showing early yellow along South Bank. That was all. I set the pen down and sat for a moment, my hands resting on the edges of the ledger, just sitting. The chair I used in those days was a straight-backed oak piece that Harlan had brought in from somewhere back east, and it had no give to it at all, which Harlan considered a virtue. A man who was comfortable in his chair would fall asleep in his chair, he said, and a sleeping deputy was no deputy at all. I never fell asleep in that chair, so perhaps he was right. After a time, I stood, closed the ledger, and took my hat from the peg by the door. The morning patrol, the real one, as opposed to the quiet early walk, would start soon, but there was something I wanted to do first. Something that had been pulling at me since I stepped off my porch and felt that hard packed ground under my boots. I wanted to go down to the creek. Now, the creek was not far from anywhere in Cottonwood Creek. That was the nature of the place. The town had been built along the water, the way most towns out here were, and wherever you stood, you were within a few minutes' walk of the bank. But there was a particular spot I had in mind. South of the main street, past the last row of buildings, there was a bend in the creek where the water had carved out a shallow pool over the years. The cottonwood trees grew thickest there, their roots reaching down into the bank like fingers gripping the edge of a table. And in the spring, that pool was deep enough to come up to a man's waist if you were foolish or brave enough to stand in it. It was the place where children swam in June, where women came to wash clothes I walked south along the road, then cut through the gap between the Haskell property and the old tannery that had been closed since before I wore the badge. The gap was narrow, barely wide enough for a man and certainly not wide enough for a wagon, and the ground there was packed dirt shaded by the buildings on either side, so that it held a trace of coolness even in the worst heat. My boots were quiet on it. A cat watched me from a windowsill as I passed, one of the half-wild ones that lived around the tannery, gray with a torn ear, and we regarded each other briefly with the mutual indifference of two creatures who had seen each other many times before and expected to see each other many times again. The creek appeared through the trees as I came out the other side, and that's when I noticed it properly, in a way that the few words I'd written in the ledger hadn't quite captured. The water was low, noticeably, visibly low. The stones along the edges of the pool, the ones that were normally half submerged, were sitting fully exposed, their tops dry and pale in the morning light, wearing little collars of dried mud where the water line had been a week ago or 2 weeks ago, gradually receding. The pool itself was still there, still holding water, but it had pulled back from its usual margins by a good 2 feet on either side, and the water that remained was shallower than I'd ever seen it at that spot. Clear, though, so clear I could see the bottom, the rounded stones, the patches of sand between them, the faint wavering shadows cast by the current, which was gentle, barely a current at all, more of a slow and patient drifting. I stood at the edge for a while, just stood there, my hat in my hand, because I'd taken it off without thinking about it, the way a man sometimes does when he enters a church or approaches something that asks for a kind of quiet respect. The sun was on my face now, warm but not yet punishing, and the air rising off the water had the faintest trace of coolness in it, a coolness that was more memory than fact, as if the creek were remembering cooler days and breathing that memory back into the morning. I crouched down, set my hat on the ground beside me, extended my hand, and let it hover just above the surface, close enough to feel the temperature change, that thin layer of cooler air that lives just above moving water. Then I lowered my fingers into it. The water was cool, not cold the way it was in spring, when the snow melt came down from the hills and the creek ran so fast and so hard that you could hear it from inside any building in town. This was a different kind of cool, a tired coolness, if that makes sense. Like the water had been working to stay cool all summer and was running low on whatever reserve it drew from. But it was still cool enough to feel good on my fingers, still cool enough to carry that particular sensation of creek water that no well water or rain barrel water ever quite matches. There's something alive in creek water, something that has to do with its movement, with the fact that the water touching your hand right now was somewhere else a moment ago and will be somewhere else again in a moment more. I let it run through my fingers, watched the way it parted around my knuckles, reformed on the other side, carried on. A leaf drifted past. Cottonwood, curled and yellowing at the edges, one of the early ones that had let go before the others, and it moved so slowly on the current that I could have reached out and taken it, but I didn't. I let it go. It turned once, gently, as it passed my hand, as if acknowledging me, and then it continued downstream and out of sight around the bend. I stayed crouched there longer than I needed to. There was no reason to hurry. The town was still waking behind me. I could hear the first sounds of it beginning to stir. A door somewhere, a voice, the distant clatter of someone moving pots in a kitchen, but none of it required me. Not yet. For these few minutes, the day was mine to spend however I chose, and I chose to spend it here, with my fingers in the water, watching the light change on the surface of the creek as the sun climbed a degree higher and the shadows of the cottonwood leaves shifted and resettled. The cottonwoods themselves were something to look at that morning. I lifted my gaze from the water and took them in. They lined the south bank in an uneven row, some old and thick-trunked, some younger and leaning, and their leaves, the shade they cast was narrow. That struck me too. In the fullness of summer, those cottonwoods threw wide pools of shadow that overlapped and merged, creating a corridor of cool shade along the bank where a person could walk for 50 yards and never feel the sun. But with the early leaf drop and the thinning of the canopy, the shade had broken apart into separate patches, individual shapes on the ground that didn't quite connect, like stepping stones laid too far apart. The sun found the gaps between them and put bright strips of light on the ground and on the water, and the effect was something I hadn't seen before. A dappled quality that was neither full shade nor full sun, but something in between. Something that felt like the season itself was in between. Not summer and not autumn, but some unnamed place where both were present and neither had fully committed. I stood. My knees protested mildly, the way they were beginning to do in those years, though I was not yet what anyone would call old. I picked up my hat, brushed the dirt from the brim with my thumb, and set it back on my head. The creek went on doing what it was doing, moving slowly, carrying leaves, catching light, and I turned and walked back toward town. The morning patrol was uneventful. I say that not as a complaint, but as a simple description of fact, and perhaps also as an appreciation. An uneventful patrol was the best kind. It meant the town was as it should be, each piece in its place, each person going about the business of their day without interference or disturbance. I walked the full length of Main Street again, this time with the town awake around me, and the character of the walk was entirely different from the early one. Now there were people. Not many, because Cottonwood Creek was never what you'd call crowded, but enough to give the street its daytime feeling, a sense of purpose and small industry, of things being done. Abigail Marsh was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store, moving the broom with long, even strokes that sent little fans of dust out into the street. She nodded as I passed, and I touched the brim of my hat. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The nod and the hat touch were a complete conversation, and both of us understood every word of it. Delbert was unlocking the barber shop. I could hear the click of the key from across the street, a familiar sound, and then the slight groan of the door as it swung inward. He disappeared inside, and a moment later, the shade in the front window rolled up with a snap, revealing the chair, the mirror, the row of bottles on the shelf. The barbershop window was one of those things I checked each morning without quite realizing I was checking it. The shade up meant the shop was open. The shade down meant it wasn't, and the rhythm of its rising and falling was as regular as anything in town. Jess Purcell was at the smithy now, moving around in that slow, deliberate way of his, laying out what he needed for the day's work. I could see the glow of his forge beginning to build, a faint orange light in the darkness of the shop interior, and the first wisps of smoke were rising from the chimney, thin and nearly invisible against the pale sky. There's a smell to a smithy that is unlike anything else. Hot iron, coal, the faint mineral tang of water on heated metal, and it reached me even from across the street, carried on the still air. It was a working smell, an honest smell, and it belonged to the morning the way the bird calls belonged to the dawn. I completed the circuit, checked the doors that could be checked, looked at the windows that could be looked at, nodded to the people who were out and about. The pen was a steel-nibbed thing that scratched slightly on the paper, and the ink was the standard dark blue that the county supplied in small bottles that never seemed to last long enough. I wrote carefully, as I always did, forming each letter with attention, because the ledger was a record, and a record deserved care. Harlan had taught me that. The first ledger entry I ever wrote, he'd made me do over 3 times because my letters were too loose. Tighten them up, he said. A man who writes sloppy thinks sloppy. I tightened them up and never loosened them again. The rest of the morning passed in the way mornings passed in Cottonwood Creek. Slowly, quietly, with a rhythm that was more felt than heard. I spent some time at the desk, going through a small stack of papers that had come in from the county seat. Nothing urgent, nothing that couldn't wait, but the kind of official correspondence that accumulated if you let it, and was best dealt with a little at a time. Requisition forms for supplies, a circular about new regulations on brand registration, a notice about a territorial court session that wouldn't take place until October. I read each one, made notes where notes were needed, set them in their appropriate piles, and felt the mild satisfaction of order maintained. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside again. The heat had arrived in earnest now. It pressed down on the street like a hand, heavy and constant, and the dust that rose from the road hung in the air longer than usual, as if even the dust was too tired to settle. The sky had gone from pale to white, or nearly so, that featureless brightness that comes when the sun is so strong it bleaches the blue. I walked to the water trough outside the livery. Old Calvin Reed kept the trough filled from the well behind the building, and it was one of those small civic duties that went mostly unnoticed but made a considerable difference to the life of the town. Any horse passing through could drink. Any dog that wandered by could help itself. Calvin filled it every morning, rain or shine, and had been doing so for longer than I'd been wearing the badge. The water that morning was warm to the touch, which was unusual. Normally, the well water kept its coolness even in summer, and I mentioned this to Calvin, who was sitting on an overturned bucket in the shade of the stable overhang, whittling a piece of cedar. "Been warm a few days now," he said, not looking up from his work. His knife moved in small, steady strokes, and thin curls of wood fell between his boots. "Well's running a bit low, too. Not dry, mind, just lower than I like." I leaned against the post of the overhang and watched him work for a moment. Calvin was not a man who felt the need to fill silence with talk, and neither was I. So we stood and sat in companionable quiet while the knife moved and the shavings fell and the heat pressed in around us. From inside the stable, I could hear the horses, the soft stamp of a hoof, the occasional snort, the sound of hay being pulled from a rack. Restful sounds, sounds that asked nothing of you and gave everything they had. "You been down to the creek?" I asked. "This morning?" he said. "She's thin." That was all he said about it, and it was enough. Calvin had a way of summing things up in a word or two that most men couldn't manage in a paragraph. The creek was thin. That said everything about the water level, the season, the heat, the dryness, the slow and steady pulling back of moisture from the land. She's thin. I could have written that in the ledger, and it would have told the whole story. I left Calvin to his whittling and made my way back toward the south end of town. I'm not sure why. I'd already been to the creek that morning, already noted the low water, already written it down. But something drew me back, the way certain places draw you on certain days, not out of need, but out of a quiet pull that you learn to trust over the years. The creek was asking to be looked at again, or maybe I was asking to look at it. Either way, my boots carried me south, past the last buildings, through the narrow gap between the Haskell place and the tannery, and out to the bank where the cottonwoods stood in their thinning shade. The light had changed since morning. It was more direct now, the sun almost overhead, and the water in the pool had taken on a different quality, less reflective, more transparent, as if the shallowness and the angle of light had conspired to make the creek reveal itself completely. I could see every stone on the bottom, every ripple in the sand, every flicker of movement. Where a small fish, there were a few, minnows or something close to them, darted from one shadow to another. The water was so clear and so still that it seemed less like water and more like a layer of glass laid over the stream bed. I sat down on the bank, not crouched this time, but sat, settling myself on the dry grass with my legs stretched out before me and my hands resting on my knees. The grass was brown and brittle. It crackled faintly under my weight, and the sound of it was the sound of summer having its way with everything. The sound of moisture leaving, of green giving way to gold, and gold giving way to brown. The earth beneath the grass was warm, and I could feel that warmth through the fabric of my trousers, a gentle, pervasive heat that was not unpleasant, just present, like background music in a room you've been sitting in for hours. A wagon passed somewhere behind me, on the road. I heard it without turning. The creak of the axle, the slow clop of the horse's hooves, the rattle of whatever was loaded in the bed. It moved at the pace of a walk, no faster, and the sound of it rose and faded so gradually that there was no clear moment when it arrived or departed. It was just there for a while, and then it wasn't, and the quiet filled back in behind it, the way water fills a footprint in sand. I sat and watched the creek. That's what I did for a good long while that afternoon, and I make no apology for it. Sometimes watching is enough. Sometimes the act of sitting still and letting your eyes rest on moving water is the most useful thing a man can do. Not because it accomplishes anything, but because it reminds you of something that's easy to forget. The minnows went about their business in the pool below me. Tiny things, no longer than my finger, silver-sided, moving in quick little darts that seemed random, but probably weren't. They'd hold still for a moment, facing into the current, their small bodies trembling with the effort of staying in place, and then one would break away and shoot to a new position, and the others would adjust around the absence, and the whole arrangement would resettle into something new that looked very much like the old arrangement, but wasn't quite. I watched this for a long time. It was like watching a conversation being held in a language I didn't speak, but could almost understand. The cottonwood leaves made their own quiet sounds above me. Not the full, rushing whisper they made in wind. There was no wind, but a small, occasional clicking, the sound of dry edges touching as a leaf shifted on its stem, settling into a slightly different position. Each click was so faint I could only hear it because everything else was so still. The leaves hung motionless between clicks, their shadows printed sharp and distinct on the water below. And those shadows moved only when the water moved, drifting slightly downstream before snapping back as the current brought a new surface to receive them. Time passed. It does that when you let it. When you stop holding it by the collar and just let it walk at its own pace, time has a way of stretching out and becoming something you move through rather than something you measure. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light to change again, shifting from the harsh white of midday towards something warmer, something with the first hint of afternoon gold in it. Long enough for the shadow of the nearest cottonwood to lengthen noticeably across the grass. Long enough for the warmth in the ground beneath me to become familiar. Part of the sitting rather than something I noticed separately. A lizard appeared on a stone near the water's edge. Small, gray-brown, its skin patterned with faint bands that matched the stone so closely it was nearly invisible until it moved. It held itself in that locked joint way lizards have, perfectly still, its tiny sides pulsing with breath, and it stayed there on the stone for a long time, doing whatever lizards do when they sit on warm stones beside low water on hot afternoons. Existing, I suppose, being present, taking the heat into its body and being glad of it in whatever way a lizard is glad. I think that's when I understood something about that day, about why it stayed with me. It wasn't the low water itself, though, that was certainly noticeable and worth recording. It was the quality of attention the low water invited. When the creek was running full and fast, there was almost too much to look at. The rush of current, the spray over rocks, the constant motion and sound of it, a kind of beautiful excess that filled your senses and left no room for the smaller things. But when the water pulled back, when it thinned and slowed and went quiet, it revealed a world that was normally hidden. The stones on the bottom, the minnows in their careful formations, the sand ripples shaped by currents too gentle to see, the reflection of leaves on a surface so calm it held them like a painting. The low water didn't take something away. It uncovered something that had been there all along. I stood, eventually, brushed the grass from my trousers, picked up my hat. I'd taken it off again, I realized, without thinking, and set it on my head and walked back to town. The afternoon had work left in it, and I was not a man who left work undone, no matter how pleasant the sitting had been. The afternoon patrol was much like the morning one, only hotter. I walked the street in the full weight of the sun, feeling it on my shoulders and the back of my neck, feeling it through the crown of my hat. The boardwalk planks were warm now, almost hot, and they gave off a faint smell of baked pine that mixed with the dust in the dry air. Fewer people were out. The heat had driven most folks indoors or into shade, and the street had a drowsy, half-vacant feel, like a room where most of the guests have gone to lie down. I checked the doors again, checked the windows, touched the latches and the locks, and moved on. At the south end of the street, I paused at the trough outside the livery and dipped my hand in the water. Still warm. A pair of flies circled above the surface, their small shadows racing across the water beneath them. I watched them for a moment, then moved on. The stable was dim and warm inside, but a different kind of warm from the street, earthier, softer, mixed with the smell of hay and horse and old wood. My horse, a brown gelding I called Ned, was standing in the stall with his head low, one back hoof tipped forward in that resting posture horses take when they've decided nothing is worth being alert for. I went to him and ran my hand along his neck. His coat was warm and dry under my palm, and he turned his head slightly to look at me with one large brown eye, then went back to his resting. I checked his water. It was low in the bucket, and what remained was warm. I refilled it from the well in the back, pumping the handle slowly, listening to the creak and groan of the mechanism and a splash of water into the bucket below. The well water was still cool at its source, cooler than the trough out front, and I held my wrist under the stream for a few seconds, letting it run over the pulse point, an old habit that felt especially good in heat like this. Then I carried the bucket back to Ned's stall and set it down. He dipped his nose in immediately, his lips parting the surface, and I stood and listened to him drink. That quiet, rhythmic pulling sound that horses make, so steady and unhurried, as if drinking water were a thing to be savored rather than rushed through. I gave Ned a pat on the shoulder and left him to it. The afternoon was wearing on. Not quickly, because afternoons in August never passed quickly in Cottonwood Creek, but perceptibly, the way you can sense a page turning even when you're not looking at the book. The light outside the stable door had shifted again, the angle a bit lower, the color warmer, and the shadows on the street were beginning to lengthen in that slow, confident way that means the day has decided to start letting go. Back at the office, I sat at the desk and opened the ledger for the afternoon entry. Afternoon patrol complete. I wrote, no incidents, heat extreme, trough water running warm. Well at livery appears adequate. Creek still low at South Bend. I set the pen down and sat back. Through the open doorway, I could see the street stretching out in its late afternoon light, the buildings casting long shadows now, the dust hanging golden in the air where a shaft of sun came between two roof lines. A dog trotted past, one of the town dogs, a brindle-colored mutt with a peaceful disposition and no particular owner, and it paused at the water trough, drank briefly, then continued on its way. I watched it go, its shadow stretching long beside it on the packed earth, and I felt the simple pleasure of watching a thing go about its business without complication. The heat began to ease, not all at once, and not dramatically. It was more like a hand slowly unclenching. The grip was still there, but the pressure was lessening, degree by degree, as the sun moved lower and the air started to remember what coolness was. By the time the shadow of the hotel had reached the far side of the street, there was an actual breath of movement in the air. Not wind, nothing so assertive, but a stirring. A faint drift from the west that carried with it the smell of dry grass and heated stone, and underneath that, the very faint scent of water from the creek. I closed the office for the evening, hung the key on its peg, checked the gun rack, the rifles standing upright in their slots, oiled and quiet, and stepped out onto the boardwalk. The street was coming back to life as the heat retreated. Doors were opening. A woman's laugh drifted from somewhere up the block. The smell of cooking, beans, cornbread, something with onions, reached me from the direction of the boarding house, and my stomach reminded me that I had eaten nothing since a biscuit at dawn. But instead of going directly home, I walked south again, back through the gap, back to the creek. The evening light on the water was something to see. The sun was behind the hills now, or nearly so, and the sky had turned a color that I can only describe as the color of old honey, deep and warm and golden, fading toward a soft purple at the eastern edges. The creek caught that light and held it on its surface, turning the shallow pool into a mirror of amber and rose. The cottonwood trunks along the bank were dark against the brightness of the sky, their bark deeply furrowed and shadow-filled, and their leaves, those that remained, were edged in gold where the last light touched them. I stood at the edge. A bird called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. Not a call I could identify. I was never much good with birds, but a soft, repeated note that sounded like a question being asked without any need for an answer. It called 3 times, 4, and then stopped. And the silence that followed was fuller for having been interrupted. The light continued to fade. The gold deepened to copper, the copper to something darker, and the first true coolness of evening arrived, settling over the bank and the water and my skin, like a cloth being laid gently over a table. I could feel it on my forearms, on the back of my hands, on the strip of skin between my collar and my hat brim, a good coolness, the kind that comes as a relief after a long day of heat, the kind that your body receives with gratitude even before your mind registers it. I walked home along the creek, not on the road this time, but along the bank, following the water's edge, south toward my place. The path was uneven. Roots and stones and the occasional soft spot where the bank had eroded, but I knew it well enough to walk it without thinking. And the sound of the creek beside me was a pleasant company. It wasn't much of a sound, given the low water, just a soft, continuous murmur, the sound of water finding its way over and around small obstacles, adjusting itself endlessly to the shape of its bed. But it was enough. It filled the silence without crowding it the way a good conversation does. The sky overhead was darkening. The first few points of light were appearing. Not stars yet, or not obviously so, but bright spots in the deepening blue that would declare themselves as stars soon enough. The air smelled of cooling earth, of dry grass releasing the heat it had held all day, of creek water and cottonwood bark, and the faint mineral scent of stone. I breathed it in and let it go, and my steps were slow, and the evening was wide, and there was no place I needed to be that I was not already approaching. I reached my porch as the last color left the sky, sat down on the step, the wood still holding a trace of the day's warmth, and unlaced my boots slowly, the reverse of the morning's ritual, each eyelet and crossing undone with the same deliberate care. I set the boots beside the door and sat in my stocking feet and listened to the creek, which I could still hear from here, running its quiet nighttime course through the landscape I had known every day of my life. The thought came to me then, sitting on that porch step with the August evening settling around me, that the creek running low was not a thing to worry about. It was just a thing that was happening. The water would come back. It always did. The rains would come in their own time, and the creek would fill, and the stones at the south bend would disappear again under the current, and the cottonwoods would put out new leaves in the spring, and the whole cycle would turn over, patient and unhurried, the way it had been turning since before there was a town here to watch it. The low water was not an ending. It was a pause, a breath, a moment of revelation, and it would pass. I sat there for a good while longer, watching the darkness settle. The night sounds began, different from the day sounds, quieter, more spaced out. A frog somewhere along the bank, its call low and deliberate, the soft rustle of something moving in the grass, a field mouse maybe, or a ground squirrel heading home late, and under it all, the creek, steady and patient, carrying its reduced water through the night with the same unhurried persistence it brought to everything. And now, friends, the fire here beside me has gotten to that stage where it's more glow than flame, more memory than heat, and the night has pulled in close the way it does when the hour gets late and the telling gets quiet. I can hear the creek from here too, running the way it always runs, the way it ran that August evening so many years ago. And the sound of it is the same sound, patient, unhurried, finding its way. That's all I had to tell you tonight. Nothing much happened, you'll notice. A man walked to a creek, put his fingers in the water, sat for a while, and walked back. That's the whole of it. But sometimes the days that stay with you longest are the ones where the least occurred, because there was room in them for you to be present, room for the world to come to you without competition. Thank you for sitting with me. The fire's almost out now. Just a bed of coals breathing their last small heat into the night air. And the stars are thick overhead. And the creek is running. And everything is where it belongs. If you find yourself with a quiet evening sometime and nothing much to do, maybe come back and sit a while, and I'll see if I can remember another one. But for now, just rest. The night's got plenty of room for that.